皆さん、ようこそ、こんにちは。今日のトピックは、商標です。けど、私は英語だけ喋っています。This is a seminar on trademarks concerning the use of dupes in the United States. This seminar is from February 2026, but I give my seminars live. And I only really upload them after I'm done providing all of the live versions. Um, you know, Obviously this is partly marketing on my part. So this is an older one, but it's still relatively fresh. But people are currently receiving newer trademark seminars. So these are the topics for today, and we will begin with what is a dupe. And a dupe is a product similar in appearance, functionality, or design to a higher end branded item, but sold at a much lower price. Unlike counterfeit products, dupes do not copy trademark brand names or logos and are often sold at mainstream retailers. These are just, taken from Wikipedia. I don't know which retailers in particular are or are not selling these. Um, you know, I'm going to guess it's something like a Walmart or a Target. Again, I don't know if Walmart and Target actually are, but these are going to be major retailers that sell these. And therefore, these dupe manufacturers can sell a substantial amount of product, right? This isn't um, someone selling a counterfeit good in a couple of small stores, supplying a couple of small stores in parts of, Osaka or New York City, um, or San Francisco or, whatever, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, with a couple of counterfeit bags. These are going to be, proudly displayed on store shelves in a major retailer. And they're going to sell a lot of them, and it can really negatively impact the sales of the premium product. It's kind of hard to understand this without seeing what is a dupe, Brian? So it's best illustrated by a comparative example. On the left here, you can see a authentic Louis Vuitton purse with the famous LV mark. And on the center part, you can see a counterfeit version of the of a purse, also using the registered LV mark. But on the right, you can see this dupe version of the purse. I don't know the entire Louis Vuitton uh, trademark portfolio. Maybe there's something about the colors here, but at least as far as this registration goes, there's no use of that mark here. This is a dupe. It's supposed to bring to mind, something like a Louis Vuitton purse, and therefore it's not necessarily illegal, at least again with regard to this particular mark. Where did this come from? You can see it's relatively unused prior to COVID, Corona. So this is just data I pulled from Google Trends. I ran this search, I think early in like January 2026. And you can see that the usage was about 15%, just before Corona really um, started in America. So like March 2020. And you can see it expands during COVID, um, much more than it had prior. And it's basically, this is up until about summer 2022. It's about 46% of where it currently is, or where it was currently at. And in December of 2025, it's basically doubled since then, right? So it really starts taking off and, getting some momentum behind it. Google Trends also allowed me to look at, what the word dupe is getting searched alongside, and you can see some of the usage of it, right? You can see like perfume dupe is number one. People have been interested in duplicate fragrances since at least I was a child. You can also see it in connection not just with generics like perfume, but also particular brand names like Lululemon, Dyson, Skims, Bog, and Stanley. These are all registered marks. People are searching for them in combination with the word dupe. Why? Why are people searching for this? Well, during the pandemic, people spent more time on social media than they did before the pandemic. Right, that makes sense. We had more free time. There was social isolation. People wanted connection. But there's also an associated economic recession, right? And this drove viewers of social media to search for lower priced alternatives to higher end goods, right? They can't afford as much. And influencers started producing more content related to dupes. And we don't really know why, but probably because of either the popularity of the subject matter, right? People are watching these videos are performing well, so we're going to make more of them. Or it's possible that some influencers actually received money for advertising these duplicate products. This graph shows the K-shaped economy that people have been discussing. The high earners in the world, who are presumably also the biggest spenders, they can afford more luxury than they could before because of this K-shaped recovery. There's a lot of demand, I think, among that group for, innovative or new products. But for the rest of us, us low earners can only afford less luxury. We can't go out and buy a new Louis Vuitton purse, but maybe we can buy something that's similar, um, possibly, probably inferior, but costs a lot less. And so low earners are more interested in these dupes, and there are more low earners than high earners in the world. I think there's an interesting question about whether that's fair use, right? Fair use of a competitor's mark is permitted in advertising or promotion that permits consumers to compare goods or services, except as a designation of source for the person's own goods or services, right? That's what we're doing here is we're not saying it's a Louis Vuitton purse. I'm saying it's a Louis Vuitton dupe, right? It's permitting the comparison of the goods or services. And people do use the phrase dupe in combination with a competitor's mark to indicate an alternative product, right? Like that's exactly what we're doing here. And for a typical social media upload, it's probably okay to say something like, "Hey guys, I love this insulated bottle. It's a Stanley dupe," right? Stanley's not going to go out there suing, some, 14-year-old boy because he told his social media followers that, he likes an insulated bottle. The uploader does not receive money from the advertiser. The uploader does not make the bottle, right? He's just recommending an alternative product. The situation might be different for an influencer, right? These aren't just typical users. These are more sophisticated individuals. They are going to use hashtags, for example, right? They might use hashtag Stanley, and Stanley is a registered mark. They might use hashtag Stanley dupe. It's possible that they'll receive advertising money from the dupe manufacturer. It's possible that they'll receive money from YouTube or whoever for, TikTok. I don't know if TikTok's compensated. I assume it is. Um, for having a popular video that discusses this dupe. And in this situation, right, the outcome is less clear, and you should really talk to an attorney if you're an influencer doing this sort of thing. And so the question then, in terms of advising these brands, is, what if you had additional protection here, right? Like of course, Stanley owns the name of their company. That's going to be like the first mark, right? So what if you had a second mark, or, I'm sure Stanley has many marks. Um, but we've got this additional mark dedicated to Stanley Dupe, right? What's the significance of that, Brian? Well, now you have a stronger case against competitors who advertise with the phrase brand dupe, right? That's your mark too now, and so your competitor can't really use Stanley Dupe in connection with their alternative Stanley products. They can say Stanley Alternative, which might not seem like a big deal, except that if you're Stanley, now you can control the results of the most common search term, right? What is someone typing into their computer? They're not typing in Stanley Alternative, they're looking for Stanley Dupe. That's the significance of those like Google Trends charts. And if, a particular social media platform allows a mark holder to, take down some of this content, then that's a really powerful tool there. And trademarks are pretty cheap. Enforcing them's expensive, but the marks themselves are pretty inexpensive. So Brian, who's registering these and how are they using them? So the most infamous one, uh, famous, maybe infamous, is Lululemon Dupe. And so this is the registration number. Famously, it's for a service mark, not a trademark. This is not on goods, at least as registered. And you can see that they have these different retail store services featuring particular goods, advertising, marketing, promotional services, they're provided through the internet. Um, this is, and we'll talk about what is actually behind, what we think is behind this, right? In a second, it is a foreign application of foreign registration and intent to use basis. There was a refusal in which the examining attorney included two articles about Lululemon dupes and required that Lululemon disclaim the word dupe. So, like Lululemon doesn't under our obligation to describe what they're going to do with it. But the articles do discuss these dupe swap events in which dupe purchasers, right? These are consumers like you and me. They might have bought a Lululemon duplicate pair of pants, and they can bring them to these events and exchange those pants for the genuine Lululemon product. Okay. Um, and the idea is that, people are going to be so impressed by having the new Lululemon product that, they'll talk about it with their friends and hopefully they'll buy Lululemon again in the future. And this information suggests why that these events are why Lululemon wanted a service mark rather than a trademark. So Lululemon disclaims dupe on its own, and they delete the intent to use basis of like, look, like, yeah, we're actually using this, and the mark gets registered. Is anyone else doing this? This is actually everybody as of the time of drafting the seminar. I haven't updated the seminar till August, but as of January 2026, there's also this serial number, this application to Aritzia. They are a Canadian company and they sell everyday luxury clothing. They file for a trademark and a service mark. Um, I couldn't find a specimen. This application is currently under suspension. The use is presumably a dupe of their own higher end products, right? So the idea is that, Aritzia sells these, their everyday luxury clothes, and that's still, the prices are still too high for some people. And so we're going to have Aritzia is going to offer alternative products under their own brand name at a lower price point to get, people to begin buying Aritzia products, with the hope that eventually they'll get to the, higher end products. That's why it's an entry-level product. Um, unlike um, Lululemon, they didn't just disclaim dupe. They did argue against the examining attorney's requirement to disclaim the term dupe. The last one is to this company called Apsvo. They are a Chinese company and sell inexpensive jewelry. And I assume that's the context in which they mean dupe. They filed for a trademark. You can see the specimen on the right, clearly labeled Apso dupe. I don't know necklaces well enough to know what, you know, um, what necklace this might be an alternative to. But presumably these are dupes of other companies' products, not merely a entry-level version of Apsvo's own products, right? These are probably like, hey, the idea is probably that Apsvo makes great dupes, and you should buy all of the different Apsvo dupes that are like, um, higher end products. So what can we think of? What can we learn from all of this? Well, the first issue is that Gen Z is more dupe friendly, right? If you're advising a company, you need to think about who that company's customers are. If we're talking about life insurance or um, expensive cars or something that's typically purchased by older generations, you probably don't need to worry about protecting against dupes. You don't need to register that second mark for like, BMW dupe or something. The older generations aren't on social media as much. They don't, they probably have more brand loyalty than younger people do. They've got more money to spend on the authentic product. On the other hand, if you're targeting a younger demographic, they are more dupe friendly, and so it becomes more valuable in this case, right? Um, man, I don't know what's a cool brand. I think Pepsi targets young people. Maybe I'm showing my age. Maybe Pepsi doesn't anymore. Um, but if you are appealing to a younger audience, like a Pepsi, for example, maybe you want like Pepsi dupe or something. Um, in the case of Lululemon, uh, you know, it, some people, there's a split in the commentary about whether their use of the dupe mark is a sign of brand strength or brand weakness. It's a really close call. I think everyone agrees it's a good move by them. That seems to be unanimous. It's very savvy. It's a great idea. I think people agree that the Lululemon events are great ideas. It's kind of a question of how do you subtract out the product quality versus the brand itself, right? If you start saying that, well, these events are great because the Lululemon quality is higher, that means that it's the quality that's carrying the product, not the brand, right? Um, and so it's kind of an academic exercise at that point, right? Like how do you separate the product quality from the brand? That's kind of where people are disagreeing. My view is that it shows brand weakness. Like I think that the Lululemon products are probably better than the dupes. Otherwise, the dupes would be more expensive, you would assume. And therefore, because I think the quality is probably better, I think that the brand is probably not as important and therefore a little bit weaker. If you kind of combine them, if you keep them combined, then of course you're going to come out with the idea that the it's brand strength. Again, it's kind of an academic exercise. Everyone kind of agrees that this was really smart for them. What about everybody else? If I am going to take this kind of counter position, it's not a counter position. I mean, there are people that agree, but it's probably the minority. I think entry level use like Aritzia, again, we don't know. I'm guessing here that this is what they're doing in product line use like Appsville. Um, I do think those clearly show brand strength. They are intended to be carried by the brand, not the product quality. Brian, what would you advise Japanese clients? The first thing would be is that it's not necessarily illegal to advertise in the US with your competitor's name plus dupe. You're going to see splits among different states, so absolutely ask your US attorney before you start doing this. But it's not necessarily illegal. This is something you could be doing in certain jurisdictions. The idea, of course, though, is not, necessarily about advertising. Sometimes you're the manufacturer that is people are copying. Copying is a pejorative word. You're the manufacturer that people are providing alternatives to, and therefore you might want additional protection. Again, not necessarily to protect your products, though in the case of Aritzia, that's clearly an option. It's more about controlling like search results. But we can't just, get um, marks for the sake of doing it, right? You have to have it use the mark in commerce. And so you're going to need to decide how you want to do that. Do you want to do something like these Lululemon trade-in events? Do you want to offer something like entry-level products, as in the case of Aritzia? Do you want to register it in connection with a particular product line like Appsvo did? You know, again, I think that registering your name in combination with dupe is a great idea, but you do need to use it somehow. Um, and that concludes the seminar. Thank you so much.